So this second plenary session is focused on net zero transition plans. We've heard about some of the significant commitments that have been made, particularly in the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow. I'm sure all of you have heard about the 130 trillion number from the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ. And we heard at the opening panel about significant concerns around greenwashing, overclaiming, how regulators are now looking at this, how we need to resolve that challenge within the sustainable finance and investment community. So can transition plans ride to the rescue and solve this problem for us, or might they be an opportunity for further greenwashing? That's one of the questions we're going to be talking about today. We're also going to be exploring how they could be used in different use cases, what different jurisdictions are doing, how different processes might relate to one another. We talked about the International Sustainability Standards Board. There's also GFANZ. There's also a transition plan task force in the UK that we'll talk about and hear about. And we've got a great panel to take us through all these things. We've got, on my right, we have our first speaker, McKenna, who's a recovering politician and currently chair of, and this is a bit of a mouthful, the UN High-Level Expert Group on the net zero emissions commitments of non-state entities. Is that right? Very sexy title. So thank you so much for coming, Catherine. And then we're going to hear from Kate Levick, who is Associate Director for Sustainable Finance at the think tank E3G, and with me co-heads the Transition Plan Task Force Secretariat. And then we're going to hear from Vanessa Havard-Williams, who's a partner at Linklaters, Global Head of Environment and Climate Change, and leads a big team working on all of these and other issues. So I've asked each of them to have some opening remarks, and then we're going to open it up. And so think about your questions, and we'll have a bit of a discussion. Catherine, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. It's great to be here, and I'm just going to put out there that I like wild swimming, and I haven't figured out where I do it here yet, so anyone can tell me the exact spot, because I went to the exact wrong spot earlier. So I am a recovering politician. I was the Minister of Environment and Climate Change under Justin Trudeau's, when he first came in for 4 years, and then the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities. And I'm just a realist. So the answer to do transitions plans matter, and do transition plans also help with greenwashing? The answer is yes, to both. The reality is, well, first of all, I should step back. What am I doing now? I was appointed by the UN Secretary General to chair his panel. It's a terrible name. I say this like comms matters in climate, but to chair a panel that looks at net zero commitments by non-state entities. You're like, what is that? That's financial institutions, corporates, as well as cities and regions. And the reason he set up this panel, and the panel includes members from around the world, there's 18, we don't do small at the UN either, is because he's very worried about greenwashing. And I think we all should be, because, well, who was here yesterday? I was not. I was in Copenhagen. I feel like I've just missed everywhere I go. I don't get quite the extreme temperatures, but we've got a problem. I mean, the problem is we've got all these great commitments. I think 91% of GDP, global GDP, is covered by net zero commitments. That includes governments as well as non-state entities. We have, I think it's a third of the world's largest publicly traded companies have net zero targets. We have GFANZ, so led by another Canadian, Mark Carney, that included more than 450 member firms across the global financial sector, representing more than 130 trillion in assets under management, and they've committed to net zero by 2050. But what's going on? The reality is emissions have never been higher, and they continue to go up. That despite these avalanche of net zero commitments, we're not seeing changes in behavior in the way we need to see them. And the Secretary General has been very clear. He said there's no way that we can greenwash by having companies, financial institutions offset their way to net zero. But he says that that this low transparency and low integrity is just another way to greenwash, that this is another way of climate denial by setting out transition plans, well, really setting out, most companies actually, financial institutions have subpar transition plans. And there's been some really good analysis that's been done here at Oxford. I'm going to get it wrong, Ben, if I do, it's very bad. So the Net Zero Tracker, yes, is Net Zero Tracker. Is anyone here from Net Zero Tracker? They've done a really good analysis of net zero targets. Only half companies with net zero targets have some form of interim target. So let's talk about that, because that's your first problem. So if you have a target in 2050, as my kids say, so I have 3 kids who are on me every single day, they said to me, you know what, all those people are going to be dead by 2050. I said they probably won't be CEOs in 3 years. So 2050 targets without interim targets is a massive issue. And who here likes drinking beer? Oh, come on, that's pretty low. I'm Irish. So I don't know if anyone's seen the analogy from the shovel, because I think it's actually a really useful analogy. So there's a Sydney man, and he says to his friends, you know what, I've got a really ambitious target to phase out alcohol consumption. I'm going to do it within 28 years. It's part of a really impressive plan to improve my health. But I need to continue drinking normally for the foreseeable future. I'm going to reduce consumption by 2049 when I'm 101. And he said that this really won't affect his drinking in the short or medium term because, and listen to these words, and by the way, I'm a corporate lawyer. I was part of a group that brought in carbon pricing in Canada. I believe in markets. I believe in the financial sector. I believe in corporations. I don't care that people make money. That's a good thing if you can also do right by the planet. But this language, just think how often you've heard this language in a different context. It's not realistic to transition to zero alcohol overnight. This requires a steady, phased approach, well, where really nothing changes for the next 2 decades. And, you know, we're going to need to make additional investments in beer consumption in the short term to make sure no one is worse off. And you know what? They're going to bring forward credits earned from days that this man hasn't drunk for the past 40 years. So the actual end date might actually be 2060. And then, I thought this was quite good. Australians are quite funny. Any Australians? Oh, yeah, we've got a few Australians here. This gentleman has bought a second beer fridge, which he describes as the capture and storage method. So, okay, am I being over the top? Yes. But the reality is, what does the science say? The science says we need to peak emissions by 2025 and have a 45% reduction of emissions by 2030. And meanwhile, we have 2050 targets with no way to get there. And by the way, just by doing a pure graph, I didn't go to Oxford, I went to LSE, but I still understand graphs. There's a real difference if you don't do anything with your emissions until 2049, as opposed to starting ambitiously right now. And so we need to do more, and that's why transition plans matter. But they have to be credible. And you know what? I was in a lot of drama when I was in politics. It's called Climate Barbie. People went after me. They really hated putting a price on pollution. Conservatives. I was like, wow, this is really surprising because it's a market-based mechanism. But I want this to be not dramatic. I want it to be so boring. I want it to be the most boring accounting exercise ever, where we have very clear standards, that where the transition plans are based on science, where you have to have interim targets that you report on transparently, that they're verified, that in terms of credits, that they're used only for residual emissions. And I should say, I'm speaking from my own perspective on this, but this is a lot of the feedback that we are getting. And that in the end, what do? That we actually figure out a way to use the markets, to use financial institutions, corporations, to do the hard work. The transition is hard. But the one thing it's not going to be, probably, is going to be orderly. Because I can tell you all the people that died, we will find out how many people died over the last few days here in Europe. But all the people who died that we won't probably hear about enough in India or in Pakistan. In Canada, we had a town of Lytton that literally exploded. All its infrastructure was melted because we had a heat dome. That there are huge impacts right now. And so we need to get our act together. And this is why we do have to be very careful. And sometimes I worry that by calling, allowing a phrase like net zero by 2050 to be out there, that we might be facilitating greenwashing. Certainly if we don't have standards, if we don't have criteria that are very clear, that are reported on. And by the way, folks should not be able to lobby against the interests of what they need to do. That includes they should be lobbying for carbon pricing. We need to price pollution. It should not be free to pollute. That we can actually make a real difference. And I think that's what we all really need to be focused on, because I really get worried. Like when sure, everyone was freaking out and saying, oh my gosh, what are we going to do yesterday here in the UK? But what are you going to do next year? What are your kids going to do in 10 years? What are your kids' kids going to do in 30 years? And so, to end on a positive note, you guys are all very smart, I can tell. The net zero, the high-level expert group is accepting submissions. We want to hear from you about how do we make net zero commitments real. You'll see there's a mandate, there are terms of reference. I'll tweet it out to the group. I'll figure out the Twitter handle or the hashtag. We're accepting comments until the end of August, because I do think it's really important. I think there's a massive opportunity, but if we don't get it right, forget about 1.5 degrees, to forget about 2 degrees. The trajectory we could be on is 3, 4, or more, and we already know it's devastating.
Thank you,
Hopefully you can make it happen.
So, given the importance of the high-level expert group and your work, I'm going to just pause for a couple of questions about that process, if there are any from the audience. Yes, at the back.
I guess it's okay depending on the question.
Oh, yeah. I'm just curious, why non-state entities? I think we're actually doing a good job of rolling out transition analysis of corporates. I think the investment industry has done a good job over the last year. It's a real challenge going after government entities who are huge emitters. The disclosure there is very frustrating. So why non-state entities?
Because we have to do both. And just looking at last year, over $747 billion was pumped into the fossil fuel industry. And I get it. I understand that there's a very big challenge with the illegal Russian war. But the reality is we need trillions to go into sustainable infrastructure, in particular in developing countries. And that's not happening, and there's a whole variety of reasons. We can go into blended finance. But when you look at the assessments of net zero commitments, as I said, really they are lacking. They are sorely lacking. And that's based on independent experts who review them. Do countries have to do more? 100%. And there is a framework for that. It's called the Paris Agreement. Are countries doing enough? Absolutely not. But that's the whole point of the Paris Agreement. It's to have a mechanism to assess for countries to come back every 5 years. But everyone's in this together. The reality is that when I was in Canada, everyone would be like, well, if only Canada just did everything. Well, okay. We have a Net Zero Oil Sands Alliance. Don't they have to do stuff too? There's only so much governments can control in the economy. And in fact, like folks here, I don't have a problem, as I say, with companies and financial institutions. I think there's a massive opportunity because there's so much capital. I hear about this all the time, $130 trillion. There's so much capital. But right now, it's not going at the pace and the scale and the direction that we need it to. But I hear you, countries have to do their work too.
And then Paul, and if you could say who you are and your affiliation. I know everyone knows Paul.
Okay, it builds brilliantly on the previous question. is it not the case that really science-based targets require science-based policy? Net zero targets require net zero policy, and it's not really necessarily about the corporations committing or about the governments in isolation. This is about an indissoluble marriage between the two of them to achieve the outcome that neither can achieve without the other.
And that's Paul Dickinson from CDP. I'm going to take a quick batch of them.
Hi, Paul.
Next one.
Good afternoon. I'm Tina Mavraki from Ingenious Limited. I would like to make a request rather than ask a question. I don't think anyone disagrees with you in this room. This is the reason why we're all here. I think exactly because of the urgency of the matter, it's about time that we started getting on the how rather than the why. So I would love to hear specifics, and I would love to hear proposals and details, and how all these alphabets that are going around will get together and start talking from the same hymn sheet and then get to results. Thank you.
Okay. The lady in front of you.
Thank you, and actually builds on the previous questions as well. I'm Ava Jackson from BlackRock. I'd love, on the how, I'd love to understand your views on the role of the private sector and the role of the financial sector specifically, and how you think that relates and what the relationship is with the role of government, what that is, and the role of companies and all of the different stakeholders and ecosystems. Coming to really the question that was just made, what is the how? How can we actually drive this forward?
So, I mean, I can take it two ways. I mean, one, first of all, I mean, we need your input, right? That's exactly what we want to hear from folks is, how. But I think when you have, as I say, getting back to the boring part, a transition plan should have a number of different elements. If you look at Race to Zero, Science-Based Target Initiative, GFANs, they all have them. I think there's a view that they need to be strengthened and that some folks maybe are not meeting them, and that is a real problem. But I think the relationship with governments is ultimately we need regulation. And hopefully everyone doesn't gasp and say that's a big problem, because right now we have a lot of folks that don't have net zero commitments, corporates and financial institutions, and so there's a competitiveness issue. And government can also hold folks accountable. I mean, governments can make clear about what's required. If you don't meet those requirements, there can be penalties associated with that. And we've already seen the move to regulation, whether it's in the UK, requiring, I think, all major publicly traded companies to have a net zero plan with interim targets and public disclosure. And you've seen that in other countries, Japan, China, moving in that direction, obviously the EU. So I think that the regulatory piece is probably where everything needs to get to. But I mean, I don't hold my breath in life. I live in Canada, that's beside the United States. It's been pretty tricky there. And so I do think these voluntary pledges, maybe I started off, I'm just trying to be a bit provocative. Because I think in life we have to be a bit provocative on this topic. We can't all violently agree on something that is so important. But I think that these voluntary initiatives are very good, but there is an alphabet soup of them. And there are different requirements, and folks are doing different things. And as we've seen for folks that actually track them, and unfortunately a lot of pressure is put on environmentalists. So they're environmental organizations or not-for-profits who are tracking these. I don't know if anyone here, I mean, it's just a lot. And so we need to have it so they're verified independently, likely through regulation. But I do think these voluntary initiatives are good, but they have to be real. It's just like everything in life. They have to result in real reductions. It's not just the net in zero, it's got to be more the zero. The net zero is a global net zero. That's actually a different thing than company net zeros. And right now, if you take offsets, it's not entirely clear, in fact, with a lot of companies, what percentage of their emissions they'll be achieved through offsets. But there's just probably not enough land on Earth right now for the current offset commitments. And by the way, I was involved in negotiating the Article 6, the Paris Agreement of the market text. So I'm someone who believes in the markets, but right now it's a free-for-all. There's low integrity for many of these. Folks that are continue to pollute, fossil fuel companies are buying very cheap offsets. They're having huge impacts on indigenous peoples in different countries. That's a problem. But there's ways of solving it. It's just there's a discipline that's required. And for those of you who are for example, with publicly traded companies, with financial institutions, you know all about disclosure, you know all about reporting, you all know all about meeting requirements. And this isn't different from ESG. And I feel sorry, well, hopefully we'll come to the other folks in the panel. I don't really know a lot about ESG. That might sound funny. I mean, it's not an area that I've focused on. I do know about climate. And guess what? It's easy. Your emissions go up or your emissions go down. The science says we need to be at 1.5. We're not on track. The money that we need to go is in the trillions to sustainable infrastructure, renewable energy, in particular in developing countries, but everywhere. The money is going to fossil fuel infrastructure. Those are just facts, and so we can deal with that, as I say, in the most boring accounting way, but making sure that we're looking at apples and apples, that there aren't competitiveness issues, so some folks are doing nothing, either because they say they're doing net zero and they're doing nothing, or they don't even make net zero commitments. But we can do this, and I think this is what the Secretary General wants. He just wants to bring some order and discipline to this so that, yes, we can deal with greenwashing, but more importantly, because I'm a positive person, more importantly, that we can actually seriously tackle climate change and limit warming to 1.5. Right now, we just have barely a chance. And so this is what, we need your help. You guys are very smart folks, and so I certainly hope BlackRock, well, I know, so a number of the organizations will weigh in, but it would be certainly great to hear from you.
Great. So we'll have other opportunities to ask Catherine questions, but I'm now going to turn to Kate. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. So, hi everybody, I'm Kate Levick. I am the Associate Director for Sustainable Finance at E3G. For E3G, which is a climate politics think tank headquartered in London. I think some of you will know E3G and many of you will never have heard of us. And if you've never heard of us, there's probably quite likely no reason you would ever have heard of us. We're quite a niche organisation and we focus really on the politics of environmental decision making. And we do a lot of inside track work with decision makers, some outside track work, and we do a lot of convening and bringing different constituencies together to inform key decision making. So I lead our finance work in E3G, and in that context, we've been sort of supporters of this concept of the transition plans for quite a while now, and we're so pleased to see the amount of momentum that is now springing up behind them. And really, the original reason why E3G got behind transition plans is that they just seemed like the obvious next step. We'd had the growing discussion around climate-related financial risk, the emergence of the TCFD, the rapid acceptance that mandatory disclosure was actually quite a good idea. But we've got all this information, we've got all these commitments. What are companies actually going to do? They understand the risks, they understand the opportunities, hopefully now. How will they be changing their business strategies and what will they actually do to meet these commitments? So this was the obvious logical step, and then what's been very impressive about that is how much private sector support that has had, both from companies and for investors. And I think that private sector support is what's driven the very rapid political and regulatory momentum, because governments can see that this is actually something the market wants and that the market wants to do. So it's really nice to be here in Oxford, having the opportunity to talk about the Transition Plan Task Force, because as Ben mentioned, E3G is working with the UK Centre for Greening Finance and Investment, which is an academic consortium where Oxford's the lead partner, and together we are co-leading the Secretariat of a new UK task force that's been requested by the Treasury. So the context of this is that at COP26, the UK Chancellor talked about how the UK would be a net zero financial centre and made that commitment, and also kind of re-upped and reinvigorated a commitment that had already been made a little bit earlier to make the disclosure of climate transition plans mandatory, both for large listed companies and for financial firms. So that had already been stated in something called the Greening Finance Roadmap a few weeks previously, which may well have got lost among all the melee that came into the COP approach, but there was then a great moment where Rishi Sunak, as was, stood up at the podium and turned this into like a global headline. And at the same time as saying that the UK would make this requirement, which will be part of a new wider suite of regulatory requirements around sustainability disclosures that the UK will bring in, the Sustainability Disclosures Regime, or SDR, the Chancellor also recognised that this is a rapidly emerging field, that there isn't a current standard, there isn't necessarily a consensus on best practice, and talked about appointing a task force to give some advice on what that would look like and to help get this into UK regulation. So, that was November, and the Treasury asked E3G, CGFI to lead the Secretariat, so that we then had a very rapid scramble to actually get that in place and to work with the Treasury and other institutional stakeholders towards a point where we actually had a task force appointed, where we had a Secretariat team up and running, where the work has started and so on. And I think in the few months really since then, we've made tremendous progress. So I'll say a little bit about what that is. But just in terms of the context of this work, the UK is moving at pace in terms of mandated transition plans and regulatory requirements. It's moving at pace alongside other jurisdictions, most notably the EU, which of course is moving fast with its own disclosure requirements, and those include some similar looking things, perhaps with different names. EU is talking more about sustainability plans, but when you get into the detail, we're talking about some very similar requirements here. And I think everyone has an eye to international standards. That was discussed in the session this morning. Certainly the UK is a very strong supporter of the International Sustainability Standards Board, and I think everybody hopes that the ISSB will in time set the international standard for what a good transition plan looks like. And in this context, the UK work's likely to be quite important because the UK is going very early on this. So the task force itself, it has a steering group, which is co-chaired by the Treasury, by the Economic Secretary for the Treasury, and by Aviva, by Amanda Blanc, who's the group CEO. And then we have a group of sort of high-level expert organisations. It's a real mixture of financial firms, including a number of the firms that are leading in the GFANZ coalition. We have the institutional presence as well. We've got the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, which in the first instance will actually be putting these requirements through. So we're working very closely with the FCA at all levels on this task force. The ISSB is participating in our steering group. We're also a multi-stakeholder kind of task force. We've got WWF on our steering group as well. So it's not only private sector and regulatory. And that steering group provides the governance function and oversees the key decisions to be made. We've also appointed a delivery group for the task force, and that's the group that is a little bit larger and is really driving the day-to-day work, doing the drafting and making some of those key operational decisions. And that's really too large a group to list, but for those interested, you can find them all on our website, which is transitiontaskforce.net. We have a whole mixture of different kinds of practitioners, so a great deal more companies, both from the financial sector and from real economy, other types of stakeholders, some other NGOs, and crucially, a lot of practitioners. People were mentioning earlier the sort of alphabet soup. There are a lot of initiatives out there, many with acronyms, and we have tried to ensure that our delivery group reflects the key best practice work that's being done by groups like the TPI, by the CA100+, that we're bringing all that knowledge and expertise into the tent. And of course, I should have mentioned GFANZ as well, which participates again both in our delivery group and also in the steering group. At steering group level, we have Mary Shapiro. So we're bringing all of that together and trying to, at pace, deliver the outcomes the Treasury has asked for. So the task force has got a 2-year mandate, and that officially kicked off earlier this year. But I think the great hope is that we will bring back some first results back to COP27. So that is the plan. Some of you will be aware that we recently closed a consultation on a call for evidence that we put out around our key initial output, and that's going to be a sector-neutral framework for what a best practice gold standard transition looks like. So we'll be consolidating the results we've got from that consultation. We also have held a number of roundtables and have more planned. We're very happy to have stakeholder input if people would like to reach out to us. But as you can imagine, we are rapidly moving towards a drafting phase, and we hope later in the year, towards the end of the year, to be bringing out a zero draft of that sector-neutral framework for best practice transition plans, and to be putting that out to consultation. And the sequence that will flow from that is that moving into next year and more into that second year of the task force's mandate, you should see more sectoral work emerging about how this would apply to different sectors, again, both real economy and financial sector. So as you can tell, this is quite a technical process. And again, we heard in the previous session, maybe we should stop obsessing about process and put our eyes on the big picture. So I think one thing I wanted to say is that yes, this is a process. You have to do a process when you're contributing towards what will eventually become regulation. But it's very important to us and the TPT Secretariat, and I know on our delivery group and steering group, that this is happening in a broader context. And really the broader context is the climate crisis. It's the Paris goal of Article 2.1c and aligning public and private flows to for mitigation and adaptation. I think it's fair to say we're also looking on the task force at where the frontier is of what a climate transition plan is. Clearly adaptation is part of a climate transition plan, and to what extent we're also incorporating other key aspects such as just transition or nature as well, because this isn't happening in a vacuum. So as we do this work, another consideration is, given that we would like this to be something that is not the UK in a bubble, but the UK sort of in the world and helping to inform international standards, what all this means for developing countries, for emerging economies. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done on that, but it's something that we're very mindful of as we approach COP27 and African COP. And I think, I'm sure this is what we'll be discussing this session, I think there's a general sense that we are moving towards a real phase of sort of put up or shut up. I think planning is needed at all levels. So the part that we are playing is around defining what a good transition looks like from a private sector firm. But planning for transition is really increasingly understood to be needed at all levels. And I think that's a big shift that we're seeing. So I'll finish there. Thanks, Ben.
Great, thanks, Kate. So very much about defining best practice. What does a good transition plan look like? Vanessa, you're advising a whole range of different firms, financial firms, operating globally. You're seeing what's going on in different jurisdictions. You can probably see where the different use cases are going to be for transition plans. Maybe you could say a bit about that.
Okay. So thank you very much for having me. The last time I was here was 34 years ago. It was a little bit more nervous. It's nice to be back. So look, transition plans are the next progression. If we start at the beginning of this, we had greenhouse gas reporting, Scope 1 and Scope 2. Actually, everybody ought to be able to do that now. Surprisingly, people still have the odd panic. Then we moved to climate-related financial disclosure. We're just finishing our first season of doing that. That has proved harder to do on a comply and explain mandatory basis than on a voluntary basis, and there's a whole load of learning that comes from that. Transition plans are the progression from that, and offers, I think, a way of systematizing and accelerating the embedding of these issues into strategy and governance. So yeah, there's process. Actually, you need the plumbing in order to do the implementation, and the implementation is absolutely critical, and we need to speed up on it. In terms of what we're seeing across different regulatory systems, I think we have the UK and the EU. The EU is a little bit behind us, I think, in their transition planning process, but is showing already an ability to embed transition plan concepts across a wider range of regulatory instruments. So we're seeing it in the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, we're seeing it in the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, it's in the Industrial Emissions Directive, it'll probably be in the EU Emissions Trading Scheme. They are managing to integrate out of disclosure and also into the real economy regulatory space. In terms of what we're seeing now, so we're about 18 months since the first transition plan that we advised on. There wasn't really any guidance then. There is now a slew of guidance, which is good. Kate's call for evidence had...
Cool.
Well, yes, but the Secretariat was brilliant in doing a particular exercise which everybody should look at. There is a fab table at the back which looks at all the different transition guidance components, and you can see where the commonalities are. It's really, really useful. I mean, honestly, it's so useful. So the bit that I think I want to build out from that is that in looking at these different transition plans, what it will cause both financial institutions and corporates to do is to coalesce around the core building blocks in a way that they couldn't over the last 18 months because there wasn't a precedent really. And it will make it a much more rigorous process. So it's requiring consideration in terms of operations, in terms of markets and product base, in terms of capital allocation. And it's also looking at some of those issues that we got from the lady who had the fab questions. So, training, roles and responsibilities, competence, what's your advocacy, how are you engaging with your competitor base? And these are all key to actually getting people to implement, which is what you need. The area, I think, of concern is really twofold. I think we're hanging a lot on disclosure, and I think we're hanging a lot on the financial markets. So there is a question about what else we need. And there is a role for financial institutions and companies to be really specific about what are the gaps. Because at the moment it's all really hanging on the private sector, but without the ability to create a level playing field from a competition perspective, which was your point, I think, earlier. And the other issue is going back to the title, disclosure risk. So look, Scope 1 and Scope 2 ought to be okay. Scope 3 is a work in progress. And the data will be rubbish initially. And we have to find a way of navigating proper disclosure in relation to that, and proper disclosure as to how do you start to achieve your short-term targets and work to your longer-term targets by reference to the fact that you're having to change behaviour on the demand side and through your supply chain. And that's not under your control as a reporting entity. So there's a whole issue about what are your dependencies, what are you doing, and what is good enough. So it feels to me like there needs to be some consideration around how we manage that, and for reporters, how they articulate the complexities, because some of this is complicated, and the dependencies, so that they are less exposed to litigation where they've used, all their good efforts. So going back to Anne's point about in the morning, about 3 things that we could do. The concept of a sandbox, I think, is fab, so show and tell. So a sandbox in the early days. I think we need a safe space to ask difficult questions. And I think it would be helpful if we could engage as between private sector, regulators, government in relation to that. So Paul's point about all the interdependencies, this is like a really complicated Rubik's Cube, and you need everybody to get their shit together at the same time, essentially. And then my last point is, in relation to litigation, there is a litigation risk. I think both regulators and people contemplating litigation, whether those are activists or whatever, need to be thoughtful as to the cases they bring. Because litigation in this space is a signal that there isn't adequate policy, actually. It has its own role, but it is unfair. Because, one corporate gets picked on when many others could also be picked on. So that whole question about being mindful and thoughtful about that, about using that tool, And are there routes through which collaboration can get to a better solution? Should be explored, I think. Final point, significant change is something that financial institutions and companies can do, but they need the landscape and the toolbox to support that. And that, I think, is the big thing that we need to work on further.
Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. Could you say just a bit more about the different potential litigation pathways as you see them?
Okay. So there's a risk of, in the US, securities fraud if there is a disclosure issue in a regulated disclosure document. There's pure misrep. So you've said that you'll do something, or you've said that you've done something, and then you actually haven't. There's the risk of breach of director's duties as well. So there's litigation around that. Actually, I think the director's duties risk is very unclear at the moment. Certainly in this jurisdiction, I think it's quite hard. But it is going to be an area for combat, I think.
Great. Okay. Well, look, let's open it up and get this conversation energized. So ask provocative questions, please. Yes? And say who you are and your affiliation.
Thanks very much. Tom Gosling, London Business School. A lot of the basis of transition plans, seems to be on sort of science-based targets and firms sort of squeezing their way down a trajectory of science-based targets. But we know, that the life of firms is shortening a lot. In the S&P 500, it's less than 20 years now, the average life of a firm. And if we succeed in cracking the pathway to net zero, it's probably going to be through some really kind of non-linear, dramatic transformations, and it may be a totally different set of firms that's kind of got us there from the ones that exist today. And I just wonder what that sort of necessity of innovation and disruption means for, firstly, the utility of transition plans overall, but actually also what are the features of what would make for a useful transition plan in that context of potentially very dramatic change.
Pick that one up. Yeah, go for it. Okay.
Well, I'll have a first go at that. So one thing is that if you know you're going to attempt to be an innovative, disruptive company, that's something you can plan for and tell your key stakeholders about, and try and use that as a way to get competitive advantage, raise capital, etc. I think I'd also want to say that the landscape of transition plans is a fairly Darwinian one when you look at it on the more macro level. If all firms are producing transition plans, then what we have there is an opportunity for the stakeholders, and there are many different stakeholders, but investors are a very important stakeholder, the predominant one probably, to choose, well, is this a good transition plan or not? Do we believe in it? Are we going to challenge this company? Will we still invest where we said we were going to invest, or we're thinking of investing? And it's going to actually help to create that market churn and market change that creates the disruption that we actually need. So while it might sound like a very static and a non-disruptive thing, actually it's a tool that can be used for disruption. I think the last thing I'd say is that, of course, our thinking is still emerging within the Transition Plan Task Force, but the direction of travel that we've got within the task force at the moment is very much to make sure that when we're setting out what makes a good transition plan, it is not just about meeting a decarbonisation target. You've probably heard the critiques of what gets called paper decarbonisation, where it's literally about getting to that magic zero number. So it's very much about enabling and scaling up, and specifically about how you're contributing to the wider economic transition to net zero. And that's particularly important in the UK context, where we have a whole economy net zero target, where we have a commitment to a net zero financial centre, and we have our interim targets too under the Climate Change Act. So it's very reasonable that you'd expect a company in the UK to be transitioning with that in mind.
So I might not be answering directly, but I think your point is important, the role of innovation, because I now feel badly because I was like Debbie Downer. So I'm going to be, the flip side is that we need huge innovation, and that's the opportunity. I mean, we're seeing net zero steel, we're seeing huge innovation in terms of cement, like areas where it's quite boring. Shipping, Maersk, like I think if I'm not wrong, they had a 2050 target, and then they said, well, they didn't know how they were going to get there, and then their supply chain stepped up, and then they said that, okay, we can do 2040. And so how do we get to that? The reality is, to foster that, and there's a lot of companies that have innovative solutions, but they're not rewarded because we don't price pollution. I know I'm very boring on this, but I mean, pricing pollution is really important. And I actually saw an interesting comment. So of course we're looking at criteria. So think hard about what criteria would be helpful. But someone said, well, why not have criteria where every company, financial institution is required to present what carbon price would be required to actually increase their ambition? Now, that's a really interesting idea. If everyone had to do that, because the problem is we're not rewarding the disruptors. There's a lot of technology. I meet companies all the time. They got this amazing technology, but guess what? It's more expensive right now because it's free to pollute. In many cases, that's not everywhere. But I do think that that's the kind of thing that is important. Border carbon adjustments, I can get very dull very fast, but obviously that's something we need to think about it without being a trade barrier. But I think that, this gets me to something that I didn't mention that, once again, I'm going to try to be more positive. I'm a Canadian, we're generally pretty positive. That we need a positive ambition loop. And so I think the extent that companies can come out with transition plans that are ambitious, but also lobby for policies that are good, as opposed to lobbying against policies that are good. That may not happen in the UK. It happens in Canada, I can tell you. I was minister. It certainly happens in the US, the draft SEC rule. A lot of folks with net zero targets are lobbying against disclosure. I know there may be pieces that folks don't like, but I'm just saying that if we could get to this point where we actually were more rational, that then we would reward the innovators. And that's what we really need. We need disruptors. We need innovation. This shouldn't be just a boring, I did say it should be a boring accounting exercise for the sake of most folks, but I want the real disruptors out there coming up with the solutions, but not pie-in-the-sky solutions. And by the way, 2025 is not very far away. That's when we have to peak emissions. And so we need innovations now, but we do need the real action now too.
Okay, quick question for the audience. I mean, we've all sort of started this discussion with the underlying assumption that these things are a good idea. Does anyone think that that net zero transition plans aren't a good idea? Do we have complete consensus? I see a hand over there. No?
Very brave.
Okay, well, sorry, yes.
I think it's not that it's not a good idea. I think we've got to, as somebody said, call it an ambition, because we don't know how we're going to get there. I think it's realistic to say it's moving to a low carbon economy is where we are realistically moving. That's all our actions right now are taking us towards a low carbon economy. And I think when it comes to a net zero transition plan, it's as people have mentioned, geographical differences and the litigation risk in different geographies is the big concern. So having a net zero plan that is not clear opens companies up to litigation, or you can get called out for greenwashing, which I think you addressed very clearly. So it's not that I don't know. I just think right now we've got to be realistic and say we know how to get to a lower carbon economy, but not necessarily net zero.
Okay, thank you. So, question at the back.
Hi, Josh Williams from the Foundation for International Law for the Environment. I just had a question about the UN expert group that you guys are on. Will it have the ability to assess net zero transition plans and comment on whether they're inadequate publicly at all?
So I should be clear. So this is it's a short-term exercise. We're doing consultations right now globally, so that's very big. And we're to report to the Secretary General in advance of COP27. So the goal is not to go into particular plans or to call out greenwashing. It's to basically say, if you're going to put out that you're net zero by 2050, what do you need to have there? And I should say there was a good point about differentiation, and that's a complicated topic for different regions. But it's intended to say these are the criteria. Like, for example, I imagine that it will require interim targets, that it will require all emissions to be covered. things like that. And then there are standard setters, so GFANs, Race to Zero, Science-Based Target Initiatives, that are the ones who actually evaluate folks. But it's also to get to the regulatory piece. So it's to say, great, here's some criteria, but we also need a pathway to regulation, so that's in our terms of reference. But it's not to evaluate particular companies or financial institutions or cities or regions, we shouldn't forget them, transition plans, but it's to provide the tools for folks to see for companies and financial institutions, others to see what, would be a good transition plan and for folks to look at when they're assessing them.
So Catherine, a follow-up question on that around scope of the expert group. So there's sort of a set of questions around what rules do we need to see, which it sounds like you will be kind of addressing. There are a whole bunch of other questions around, I guess, the architecture of net zero commitments. So who sets the rules? Who tracks progress? Who adjudicates? Who names and shames? Who marks the homework? How do we avoid conflicts in that process? Those sorts of questions. Is that in scope for you?
Well, I think we will probably get into, the fact is it is very tough. ISSB has been set up. We do need to have some convergence, including in the from a regulatory perspective. I feel for folks when you have to, you have different, criteria standards. But I think that, once again, the scope, we don't have a huge amount of time. But I think making recommendations along those lines. But there are very good SBTI, Raise to Zero, GFANs, the Asset Owners Alliance. There's some really good initiatives out there. But by the way, there's a bunch of folks that are just saying it, and then there are a bunch of folks who aren't saying it at all. So I think it's that, then pushing the regulation. And the other piece for those of you who are in the UNFCCC, it's also looking at how you bring in these commitments into the Paris Agreement more formally. So the global stock take, that's quite nerdy, but looking at that process too.
Yeah, great. Vanessa, did you want to come in?
Just on some of the standards, so the stuff in TCFD and ISSB on disclosure on transition plans is fine, but it's sort of common sense stuff. I think the area where the underlying problem sits, and which over time we will have to look at, is the greenhouse gas protocol in relation to Scope 3, where I do think there is need to revisit and look at where the areas of confusion may be.
Other questions? So Simon, do you want to wait for the mic? So here you are.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Simon Mundy from the FT. I have a question for Kate. It's sort of a conceptual question to do with the task force paradigm. Because I've been thinking of various conversations I've been having with people, not necessarily about this particular task force, but others, TCFD, TNFD, TS, VCM as was. And various people have the concern about the issue of representation on these task forces. They're largely, not entirely as you've pointed out, but largely made up of people from big companies. And some people have the concern that this is getting perhaps dangerously close to companies getting to write their own regulation. Of course, it's not as simple as that. There are other stakeholders. The regulators don't have to take anything that's recommended by the task force. But nonetheless, from your perspective as somebody who's leading one of these task forces but is not from big business, how justified do you think these concerns are?
Well, I think the concerns are very understandable, and I think there is, real sensitivity in civil society generally about, what sort of smacks of maybe self-regulation, writing your own rules, etc., and that is a critique that can sometimes be levelled at some of the different industry initiatives. But this is a very old dynamic. We've been having industry initiatives spring up to try and create parts of the solution to climate, for a couple of decades now. I think they have a crucial role to play. And so that's more of a general statement, not specific to task forces. When it comes to task forces and UK task forces, I can only speak to what I know. So with the Transition Plan Task Force, certainly, Ben and I were working very closely with the Treasury in terms of, the decisions that the Treasury were taking about how to set the task force up and who to invite to participate in it. And we were very mindful of trying to get the best possible expertise in the room. That was the goal, and there certainly wasn't any intention to make that a private sector only group. And I think you see that if you look at the list of who's involved in that particular task force, especially in the delivery group, which is really the group holding the pen on a lot of these things. We have a very wide stakeholder mix. We've also been very conscious that these things are by definition exclusive. Not everyone can be on them, so we've been working on consultation. We've held several different private sector roundtables. We have a civil society roundtable coming up shortly. We've had one open consultation already. We will have another one at the end of the year when we launch our zero draft, and by the time we get through some of the sectoral work, I promise you, you always will be sick of transition plan task force consultations. So we really want to get all the views in. And then finally, as I've said before, this is something that the Treasury has asked for. It's not writing the regulation, so that will still be in the hands of the regulators and the governments. And I have an additional perspective as well of sitting on the Green Technical Advisory Group, which advises the UK on the taxonomy. And I'd say from that, I don't know how the list was put together for that one, but I'd say it's a very similar story. If you look at who's on that, it's a broad set of constituents. It's certainly not only private sector. And there's quite a wide range of views in the room, I can promise you, when those discussions are held.
Catherine, do you, in your group, do you have big business on it? Do you see that's a problem?
We have someone who's from Alliance. We have a CEO from a Colombian company. We also have a scientist. I also said it had to be 50% women, which even the UN had a hard time doing. I said, I'll give you binderfuls of women. We have activists, but we also have folks that are from less developed countries and global south, because these are complex issues and you do need to think about unintended consequences. I mean, I'm actually quite interested in the work on just transition and nature-based solutions, unintended consequences there as well. And so I think we have a very diverse group, and that's because the UN represents, it is intended to represent the whole world, which is great. It's very challenging in our context to consult with everyone. We're certainly trying our best to hear from different folks. But to the question, which is a really important question, I'm not going to talk about these task force, I don't know, but I've been part of task force, I've organized task force. You need diversity, and you need people who can think outside the box, and sometimes those are people who are going to actually be provocative, because that's the only way you're going to actually get good policy and good solutions, and also understand unintended consequences. For example, scope 3 in supply chain. We had someone say, we're from, African country. Are we all going to be left out, all of our companies? So that's something I thought, well, okay, I wouldn't necessarily have thought of that. Indigenous peoples, markets, I believe in markets and credits, but the impact on indigenous peoples, they want to be part of the solution, but they don't want to be, contributing to the loss of arable land or getting underpaid for what they're doing. So I think that is a really important thing. I think it's often not discussed enough about the dynamics on that, and there is groupthink. And in the end, as we talk about regulation, if the same folks are putting forward recommendations that are then going to be lobbying in a particular way, I'm just saying that as a minister, as former minister, that can be a real challenge.
Okay, so I'm going to take a batch of questions this time. So, lady right at the back.
Thank you. I'm Deborah McCoy. I work for Bain & Company. I'm a partner there, and I lead our capital markets and sustainability work globally. My question is about the laws of different jurisdictions. So Vanessa, perhaps it's more for you, but others may have a comment. It appears a number of law firms around the world are quite nervous to advise clients on disclosures at this point because of the fragmentation between the different regulatory frameworks and the enforcement. This has come up, but I guess my question is, are there forums right now where any of you is seeing regulators try to come together and reduce the exposure that companies especially, but maybe also investors would be taking in now their actual desire, I think some of them, to disclose more?
Really great question. Okay, so there was, I think, a lady wearing black. Oh, sorry. Yes. Yeah.
Hi, yes, this is a question mostly for Catherine, but interested in everyone's thoughts. I was wondering, when you're thinking about the pathway to regulation with the outcome of the work that the high-level expert group is doing, how are you thinking about the role of courts and litigation in potentially pushing that forward, as we've seen happen with the UN Guiding Principles and, you know, the new spate of due diligence legislation? I appreciate it's very early days, but really interested in any thoughts on that.
Could you just say who you are as well?
Oh, sorry, Catherine Hyam from the Grantham Research Institute at LSE.
Wonderful. And then we have a gentleman on the side.
Thanks. My name's Charles. I work with Seahorse Environmental. We're a public affairs agency. So Vanessa mentioned a couple of times this idea that an individual company has to write a transition plan, but that may be reliant on much wider changes that they're not necessarily in control of. And I was just wondering if I could sort of direct that thought towards Kate and Catherine for what the task force and what the expert group were thinking of in terms of how you balance specific responsibilities with a wider transformation and where the line is drawn and what a given company is responsible for. Thanks.
Three great questions. So let's start with Vanessa and then go to Kate and then go to Catherine.
Forums to align disclosure requirements. I think IOSCO's doing some work in relation to that. That's an association of regulators. Clearly, there is discussion between the standard setters and I think constructive discussion. I don't think we will get away from having differences because I think everybody wants to be special. So the EU will want an EU solution. The UK will leverage ISSB, I hope. The SEC is doing its own thing, which is this, but they all leverage TCFD. So actually, if you look at them, you know, you can. I think the way we're seeing people respond is to see what their base case is in terms of where the weight of their operations of their business is, and then work out how to build up for other regions. It's not perfect, it may coalesce more, but that I think is where we will get to. I'll touch briefly on the role of courts. It's a really good question. I think, for me, the way I think about it is it's framing some of the areas of uncertainty and some of the consideration that may drive people towards a more skinny disclosure, and I think that is an area that probably we need as a team to have on our to-do list to think further about.
Cool. Thanks, Vanessa. I'll pick up just on the question about what do you do about the things that you can't control. I think this is really the nub of the issue about transition plans, really. This is partly why it's so scary to take a 2050 commitment and turn it into an I will do this plan, because there's, even with the best knowledge in the world, there's a high level of uncertainty and there are things that you won't have complete control over. So what do you do about that? So I think, the first thing to say is that it's important to understand what things you can control and what things you don't have full control over, and to understand that for your own business risk management and your own ability to manage that business and make general business strategy and plans, not only including climate transition plans. So part of general business planning, including climate transition planning, is really mapping that out and understanding it. With climate transition planning, some of those dependencies are very likely to be related to policy and the need to put strong policies in place that help mobilize investment in particular directions. So a valid, and I would say probably expected, part of a transition plan will be, as a company, what are you going to do about that? What do you seek? What representations will you be making to who? Are your advocacy activities all lined up and consistent with one another so you're not accidentally advocating for something that will help your transition plan over here, but in a trade association over there that's arguing for the direct opposite. So getting all of that in order. The other thing I'd say about uncertainty in general is it's sometimes easy to forget this is not a black and white, one-time thing. So we make plans all the time in our lives, in our work, which have to be changed in 6 months, a year, because things change. It's no different with transition plans. Any transition plan that's written now will probably be looking quite different in 5 years' time or replaced with a different transition plan. That's actually okay. That's part of the planning process. What is, I think, going to be judged by wider stakeholders and by shareholders is not have you changed your transition plan because the facts on the ground change. That's probably likely to be a good thing. It's, is your plan a robust and credible plan, the one you have today? Is it based on sound assumptions and evidence? Yes, of course there will be uncertainty in it. What are you doing about those uncertainties? How are you managing those risks and opportunities? But no one is expecting anyone to have a crystal ball between now and 2050, and planning is a dynamic process.
Well, I mean, I certainly agree with that. And I mean, look, it's probably easier to say, this is what we're going to do next year, the year after, in the next 5 years. I mean, the only way you can have a real plan to get to 2050 is to start now, to have a baseline, to actually understand your emissions. And for Scope 3 is obviously, it is challenging and it's going to be messy. And these things, iterative process, and I think that's something regulators are thinking about. So I'm a recovering lawyer too, not just a recovering politician, recovering lawyer. I did trade and competition law. But I get the litigation risk. But in a way, if you're in my shoes or you're just looking at what's happening planet, I worry sometimes, and I'm not saying that is certainly not probably coming through Granholm Institute and Lord Stern too. You can say hi to him for me. That's not coming from that vantage point. But the reality is, I'll just go back. So it's Tom Hale. He's not here. I don't think he's away this week. Who the Net Zero Tracker? They looked at pledges. I'll just once again reiterate. Most folks don't have to worry about litigation risk because all they've said is they're going to be net zero by 2050. I don't think you got much of a litigation risk there. You got greenwashing risk, but maybe you will have a litigation risk because you're not really potentially doing anything, but that only half of companies with net zero targets have any form of interim targets. Any form of interim targets. 2/3 don't have minimum standards, so they don't have a specific pledge. They have no plan, real plan, on how they're going to achieve interim or long-term targets. They aren't taking immediate action. They're not having annual progress reports. So I am sympathetic to that. I think we do need to think about that. I think there are jurisdictions where there will be litigation. And sometimes litigation is a good thing. It's probably really bad if you're the company, but that you do, get some more certainty in a way. And in some places, there's going to be a ton of litigation. In the U.S. is, I don't know what we do with the U.S., just generally. That's actually a broader comment than that. But what's that? Litigate. Okay, well, we'll just call up the administration. But I think that, I think on that, though, I do think the role of regulators is really important. And I think actually working together, I think that is happening. That TCFD and then moving with these other initiatives, you're right, everyone wants to be a bit special, but I think, trying to standardize it as much as possible. But the reality is we actually really need to see action. And so that does require, I know folks don't necessarily want to do Scope 3, but it does require that. And in particular, going back to the Oil Sands Alliance, Net Zero Alliance, they don't talk about downstream emissions. They don't talk about Scope 3. The focus is on technology solutions that the government will fund or else it won't happen, solutions that are not scalable right now. And I'm using that as an extreme example, but I do think that we are seeing a lot of net zero commitments. I think that's good, but now we need to see the details. And I'm worried a lot less about litigation risk, which may give I worry about it, and we're not going to be in the weeds of that. It is the regulators and folks that are, that they will be the ones, our criteria will likely not get into that level of detail. But I worry that people won't act. That's what I worry about. That's what my kids are going to call me about tonight. They're going to say, why did you go to Oxford? Did you make some progress? Did folks listen to you? Are folks going to do more? Are businesses going to do more? Financial institutions going to dig deep and figure out how to get the money going away from fossil fuel infrastructure, get off coal right now, get into renewable energy. I know getting off coal is hard, and there will be an increase in the short term for Germany. Actually, I was in Germany, I should say. I was just there at the Petersburg Climate Dialogue, and it is really impressive what Germany is doing. They're doing something really hard. They're actually taking a crisis and actually trying to do more. You might dispute certain elements, but when I talk to the minister, they're really, really trying. That's what we all need to do. This is going to be messy, folks. It's going to be messy and it's going to be hard. It's going to require all of your brain power, ingenuity, and pushing governments to do the right thing so that we actually get there.
Okay, another batch of questions. So we've got two over there on the same row, I think.
A lot of the net zero transition plans we've been talking about so far have been focused on corporations, but about $130 trillion have been committed under GFANZ to start, for having financial institutions to start to decarbonize their portfolios as well. Unfortunately, like many of their corporate counterparts, we're not seeing action as swiftly as needed, and like the corporate sector, we don't have until 2049 to wait until we're seeing real movement there. So the question is, for financial institutions, what are best practices they can start to implement now to work towards decarbonizing their portfolios?
Okay, great. Another Sierra Club question. Oh, okay, fine.
Thanks. Ben Cushing, from Sierra Club in Washington, D.C. I appreciate the comments about the U.S. I totally agreed.
Whoops.
That's okay. Actually, a question for you, Catherine, in relation to the high-level working group at the UN. How do you see that in comparison to what the Race to Zero has recently come out with, the criteria, which I actually think was quite strong and specific in calling for members, which include thousands of non-state actors, including financial institutions, all the members of the various GFANZ initiatives, to meet by June of 2023. It was remarkably specific when it comes to these types of criteria. And so how do you expect with the results, the recommendations coming from your working group to be different from the Race to Zero? And then I guess in relation to all of these different sector agreements, what is the enforcement mechanism? I think it's great to have these criteria, but GFANZ just put out 100+ page recommendations, guidance, the Race to Zero criteria. Companies might see that due date come and go. Do they get kicked out of the initiative if they don't meet that criteria? Is there other enforcement mechanism, or do we just sort of hope and maybe people will litigate, or maybe people won't? I'm curious your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And then we had somebody else on. Okay, this is, yes, Irene. In the green. Who I know doesn't work for the Sierra Club.
It works. Thanks to all the great female speakers. Big applause for you. I have one remark on talking about regulation. I sit with Henner Ascher on the steering committee of the Network for Greening the Financial System, and there we're also looking into transition plans. So what is, from a prudential regulator, important to be in it? And I want to build a bit on the question of the Shira initiative on the unintended consequences for financial institutions, because it could have the incentive to just divest, right? Pull back, instead of really enforcing companies to make this transition. So I'm just very curious to hear your views on that. Thanks so much. And my name is Irene Heemskerk, by the way, from the European Central Bank. Thanks.
Heading up the Climate Hub at the ECB. So who wants to go first? Catherine, maybe? Or a few directions of you?
I'm just trying to remember all the questions now. I'm just getting so old and tired. Okay, so financial institutions. Yes, I mean, financial institutions obviously are part of this. And as I say, the high-level expert group, the problem is it's all non-state actors, so we aren't even spending time talking about cities and regions, although they're very different. But financial institutions, I mean, I think that there are very specific things. When you look at CapEx, obviously that's important. I mean, where's the money going? And I do think the point, so maybe I'll just link a bunch of different things. I mean, I think your point, we don't want everyone to divest. Obviously, that's an important point. We have heard that from Larry Fink and others, that it's not very good if, folks who want to do things divest, and then it's all the bad guys who are owning these things, and they continue coal forever. So that's obviously a problem. But let's take coal. We're still having folks invest in new coal, I believe, who are also part of these initiatives. We got a problem. Coal, if we can't do coal, I was with the UK, Claire Perry, who is, she was the former Minister of Environment and Climate Change from the UK. We started the Powering Past Coal Coalition. It was about getting off coal. We need to get off coal as soon as possible. We need to figure that out. And there are some good initiatives. There's other initiatives going on to do that. But the problem is, I mean, if we don't actually look in and make decisions now, talking about 2050 for financial institutions where the money is flowing in the wrong direction is a problem. And I'm not saying everyone is part of the problem, but I do think we just need a lot of transparency on that. To getting to, and Race to Zero, so I think it's great. So in a way, and of course, Race to Zero, they're part of it's the high-level champions. Race to Zero, GFANZ, it's the same group. So we're talking about folks who are also not part of any of these initiatives, whether it's Race to Zero, SBTI, or GFANZ, or whatever, and asset owners. There's no end of these that aren't part of the more, the credible ones. But you've already seen I think, a positive thing, which is these initiatives, as a result of the expert group just being created, have said, we're going to look at this. But I think one of the big challenges is, as you say, what if you don't comply? Because there was an analysis, and many of the members don't meet the starting line for Race to Zero. So I think that Race to Zero is thinking about that and saying, okay, if you don't meet that, you're out. But the problem is when you have your own body evaluating you. So there's an independence issue. And I think we can't just put it on public, not-for-profit organizations, Sierra Club, others to evaluate all these commitments. It's just far too hard to do that. So that's where you do get into independent verification. So you saw Macron and Bloomberg announce a new initiative. The thing is, there's so many initiatives, it's hard for me to keep up, but they announced a new initiative where they would have a portal, but they would have experts decide what was going to have to be disclosed, and it would be there. I think they should have a verification element. If you're going to do that, you might as well verify it. But I think, once again, it does get us to the regulatory piece. Because as bad as it may be, if you say there are different rules and the regulation, they haven't quite figured it all out, the problem is there is a competitive disadvantage or a first mover disadvantage potentially if you're out there doing these voluntary initiatives and your competitor is saying they're net zero by 2050 and doing nothing. You're doing things, you put it all out there and on the ice, and then you get slammed for it. So I think that is why the regulation piece, at the end of the day, there is a limit to voluntary kind of self-governing, self-verification, although I know there's some independence, there is independence to it. I think there's challenges to that.
By the way, I do think that's a really, really big issue, the point you raise. And with Race to Zero, you've got the two high-level climate action champions. So one is appointed by the current president, and the other is the immediate past, right? And basically, they decide everything. Every decision goes through those two. And there is a bit of a concern, from what I can tell, that the next two high-level climate action champions might be a bit less aligned than the previous two, and then that creates some issues within the system. So something, hopefully, that you all make some recommendations on. Who else wants to come in? Vanessa, Kate? Kate, do you want to go first?
On the financial institution issue, so institutions who are active in the UK and the EU will be picked up through the regulatory change. And actually are doing, a number of them certainly that I know are doing a lot of work on this. And really what we're talking about is plumbing through the activities of the institution or the corporate, whoever's got a transition plan. What I think is difficult is the schizophrenic environment in the US where you basically run the risk of getting dinged by both sides because of some of the challenges that are arising from state legislation and state-driven litigation. And that's just a very complex area. That's all I think I can usefully say. On prudential regulation, that is clearly an area, and prudential, the engagement of prudential authorities. Again, I'm not going to say much beyond the fact that I think it's probably, it's in train. There are discussions from what I can see, and you will know more than me actually, but it's somewhat behind, which is probably right at the moment, but I think it is an area to watch in future.
So I won't add much on the first question because I think a lot's been said by the other speakers, but just to say, obviously there is something of an enforcement gap. This comes back to the earlier question from the FT as well. And I think, it's fair to point out that understanding that gap, is probably one of the dynamics that's driven the creation of the H-leg, for one thing. So it will be great to see what contribution the H-leg can bring to this through the Secretary-General. But also, this is clearly a dynamic behind what we're now seeing, which is this rapid move into the space by regulators to put in place sort of legal mandatory requirements that can be backed up. And I think, we're in this dynamic period right now where that will all be very normal in a few years' time, and that's happened very fast. It's happened so fast, a lot of firms have even struggled to keep up with it, but partly it's been because there's been this understanding that a bit more governance and enforcement is needed around this. I think it's fair to give a shout out to the central banks and the financial regulators for having gone early with this. So, supervisory expectations on banks and insurers, with the Bank of England playing a leading role there, have really emboldened other regulators to step in and take action on this. And I should mention the Bank of England is an observer to the steering group of the UK task force and quite an active collaborative observer as well. So that's given us some perspective on the needs of supervisors, although I wouldn't claim to be an expert. But I would briefly say, obviously you can come at it from two ways. You can look at the microprudential needs, in which case what supervisors are going to need is to really see that firms have understood the climate-related risks and opportunities they face and have got a transition plan that deals with those, and that they also understand the risks and opportunities around the delivery of their transition plan. And then on the macro level, I think that's quite an interesting use case. There are a number of different users of transition plans, and I think when you come to central banks, they're going to be trying to look across the whole economy and sort of add up all these plans and say, when you put them all together, what does that mean? So that's conceptually quite interesting. It's a way of taking the temperature of how's our transition doing. It also creates some interesting technical challenges for us, incidentally, when we're looking at, what makes a good transition plan, because it is something to bear in mind when we think about the balance of to what extent do you have potentially a very idiosyncratic type plan that particularly speaks to your industry and the particular risks and opportunities and exposures of that industry, versus to what extent do you have very common metrics that are aggregatable, so you can actually do that summing up and look across the whole economy.
Okay, last batch of questions. So we're going to go on this side. So starting at the back, and then the guy in the middle, and then Christoph here.
Hi.
And we'll add Mary as well.
Super. Hi, it's Beth Burks from S&P, and I'm going to try and ask a little bit of a provocative question in the spirit of the day. Do you think 2050 is the right time horizon for all companies to set a transition plan? And I'm thinking, just as a basic example, if all automakers transitioned to net zero based on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions at 2050, then we would still have the legacy cars that have a certain amount of asset life left. So maybe I'm kind of being one of those annoying people at conference that kind of makes a point rather than a question. But I would just like to understand if that is being discussed in any of your forums.
Great, thanks, Beth. Somebody in the middle somewhere? No? Okay. Oh, yes.
Hi there, Camille Cluza, ClimateX. Interesting question, I would say. None of you have spoken today about inequality with regards to the transition planning. So obviously we know that at some form or shape, the society will pay for the transition to net zero. So the corporates will magically make the costs pass on to the customers. We've got the UK Gov being quite hot on the idea of having at least energy performance rating of C by next year for a number of different parties. Then we've got just overall swapping a simple car and so on and so forth. The question is that a couple of you have raised, pay or tax the pollution. The question is how is it going to be done across society, because the poorest layers of society at the back of it will become even poorer, hence the disparity will be even larger. So just question around how the government is thinking.
We're going to have to speed up. So next question. Make it precise and quick. So this is Christoph.
First of all, thanks for the great panel. Really enjoyed the discussion. Two quick questions that I wanted to pick up. Number one is the role of state-owned enterprises. You mentioned before kind of the state sector, but the state-owned enterprises is actually a different beast, and we're not sufficiently looking at that, particularly across Asia, where the state-owned enterprises play such a massive role in a lot of the polluting industries. And the second question would, kind of picking up our colleague's question from Israel, would red taxonomies actually help to better understand from where we want to transition? We only talk about where we want to transition to and mobilize finance for green, but are we clear from where we need to go out as fast as possible? And so red taxonomies are they a better solution?
Okay, and then we've got another recovering politician, Mary.
Cray, recovering, I was going to say alcoholic. No, still drinking. Recovering politician, I used to chair the Environmental Audit Committee, which audited the UK government's progress in policy in this area. Now professor at Cranfield and chair of the Ethical Trading Initiative. I had a comment to you, Catherine, that I think we might be in a position where through TCFD and ISSB, we see non-state actors leapfrogging state actors. One of the things I do is teach civil servants about this, and if you look at the UK's greening government commitments, it's things like reduce waste, reduce water, reduce carbon. It's absolutely airy-fairy. There's no base, you know, they set their own standards and nobody marks them. So I think there's a real problem, particularly here in the UK, on that. For Kate, reflecting on the previous comments around inequality, where's the S in ESG? You know, I represented a community where the transition away from textiles and coal was to outsource it to countries and to leave generations of people on the dole. Those people are now facing a winter of, you know, massive fuel prices with very little savings. So how are we involving organised labour and unorganised labour in these groups around some of these new taxonomies? Because if citizens aren't involved, we can't rely on wildfires in London to wake them up every couple of years to the dangers that they are literally living through. And a question for Vanessa, sorry, this is classic politician thing, but abuse the floor. Just on the issue around leaving the EU, Brexit, at the moment, all European countries, EU countries, will have to abide by the ECJ. We no longer have to abide by the ECJ's findings on things around air quality, water pollution, waste. Where do you think our leaving the EU could leave us in terms of enforcement? Because it's clear that the Committee on Climate Change and carbon budgets here in the UK are necessary but not sufficient for serious progress.
Well, okay, so we've got 7 questions in all. And great questions from Mary. And actually, to add to that, I think this one's for Vanessa, the recent High Court judgment on net zero and whether this is relevant for our conversation. So, Vanessa, could you go first, followed by Kate, and then Catherine will give you the last word, if that's okay.
Wait, 30 seconds?
No,
It's okay.
You can fully answer them, and then we'll wrap up.
Gosh, you're all lovely. Thank you very much. The net zero case, I think the most important thing about it is the level of scrutiny. I have to say, I read the judgment really, really quickly, and there is a lot of judgment, but it seemed to me that the area of dispute was reasonably circumscribed, but the level of engagement of the court and the rigour is in itself a discipline. That's what I take from a quick read. We'll have to see what other people think. Leaving the EU, yes, I think it is a challenge, but I think the issue with it is, will we have the levers for enforcement and an EA, an environment agency that feels able to engage and to take action and has the resource to do that? I'm not particularly concerned actually about at the moment, about the rigour of the courts. There is a risk that as we the longer we're out of the EU, the more our standards will diverge, and that's clearly an area that we chose for ourselves. The position, the just transition points, there is a limit, I think, to what corporations can do in relation to the huge issues that yes, we can all see facing people over the next few years. There is a real need for policy intervention in relation to that. I think as a private citizen, you know, in this I'm not speaking for any organisation, but I think it's not. There's only so much that the corporates can do in relation to their own stakeholders, and they can do things in relation to their workforces. But I think actually that is holding a big area where we need government to respond, and we can see governments responding across Europe. I think that's probably enough for me.
Cool, thanks. Well, I mean, I'll just pick up the one addressed to me and try and take in the inequality one a bit as I go. I would have loved to try and answer all of those. They were great questions. I know we've run out of time. So, first of all, I would say that making transition plans a norm does have the potential to support dealing with energy security and with cost of living. So these are potentially useful tools, certainly not a full solution, but I don't think these things are in opposition at all. I think unless you have a company that is fully automated and has no externalities, it is impossible to transition it without having an S. And I think that's going to be fully part of what is expected in a transition plan. You know, whether you're looking at sort of employees, communities, customers, or you know, the implications of phasing out or phasing in new economic activities, this is just an integral part, and we won't get anywhere without it. I'm very pleased to say that we've done this consultation recently on a call for evidence, and we've got a number of responses, I know, from labour movement and the trade unions, and we were very pleased to see that, and we will be engaging further. And then just to say, yes, there is an issue around phasing out of assets, and ultimately who benefits from that process and who pays for it. GFANs, you know, who can get a lot of stick, but do, you know, consistently put their heads above the parapet, have recently published a paper on fossil fuel phase out. I think there's further to go to make that, you know, a full societal discussion, because there is only so far that the private sector can itself set the rules for that. I think citizens have a say in that and governments have a say in that, and I think that's a debate that's going to get more and more pressing as we move forwards.
And one thing, maybe at the very end of your remarks, could you let us know how this community can help you in the important work that you're doing?
Sure, okay, so I'll try to be really fast. Just to explain net zero by 2050, that's like what the science says. We have to be net zero by 2050. It doesn't mean that everyone has to do it at the same pace. It's going to be more challenging for others, but we need to be net zero by 2050. And by the way, with the automotive sector, they're moving faster than ever. One, it's regulated. Remember when the first, I think it was Europe, I don't know which country, said they're getting rid of the internal combustion engine, maybe by 2035, and then suddenly Canada was like, great, we're going to do that too. So, I mean, I wouldn't worry so much about the automotive sector, but just net zero, just understanding what that means. On inequality, that's hugely important. So, but it's not always as obvious as you think that folks are going to be hurt. So I was a minister. You have to think about that. You will get very quickly unelected if you don't think about people's jobs and the cost of living. So we did a price on pollution. The majority of folks get more money back than they pay. We've raised millions of families out of poverty, because if you don't have a car, or you live downtown, you take public transit, you don't have multiple houses, you're going to pay less and you're going to get more money back. But I made sure of that. I said no money was going for anything else. We were giving all the money back to people. That was a choice. That was a good choice, because it was helpful in an election that was fought over carbon pricing. But also, when we said we were phasing out coal, that's phasing out jobs. So we did a Just Transition Task Force. I don't think we solved everything, because I think these things are hard, but we went to communities in Canada where the only thing in town is coal. That's like the direct jobs and indirect coal. And 600 people were in a room, not fancy like this, in like the school gymnasium, and they were angry, and they were sad, and they were scared. They were worried about their futures, their kids' futures, their communities, but they actually appreciated that people actually took some time to talk to them. Because folks are not People aren't dumb. People know climate change is real, but of course they're worried about jobs, and of course they're worried about cost of living, and that's what good politicians worry about too. And you figure out policies to support people, but you don't give free rides to the private sector, and you just try to muddle your way through. State-owned enterprise, 100%. And I'm like, does that fit under non-state? It's really not, because it's called state-owned enterprises, but I mean, that should fit within the Paris Agreement and what countries are required to do. But back to border carbon adjustments, we can't talk about everything here, but that is, not an irrelevant point there. Will the private sector leapfrog states? Well, let's take the example of vehicles. It's both, right? Like, it's a symbiotic relationship that you saw, some companies move, like Tesla started doing that. Folks started, saying, oh, this is actually really cool technology, I want to buy the car. But then you also saw regulators saying, well, gosh, how are we going to tackle emissions in the transportation sector? We got to get rid of the internal combustion engine. So you need that relationship, which is why actually addressing lobbying is really important. Because if you're going to be net zero by 2050, then you lobby against policies like carbon pricing or other policies that are important, then we're just not going to get there. The last thing, how do you guys all help us? Okay, right. Well, you make a submission to the expert group, and there is a portal. I know that sounds really exciting, portal, but we really do need to hear from you, and that's high-low, right? Like, and I've said that because I talk to kids, young people. Talk to CEOs. We actually need everyone to say, okay, how are we going to make net zero by 2050 real? And some of you are in the weeds of this. So I think that's important. It's not that we can solve everything, but we certainly have discussions with everyone, especially the major actors, that all the acronyms that you've talked about here, we're talking to all the acronyms. There are actually people behind them too. But the deadline for submissions is the end of August. And it is really important because, to end on a positive note again, we had the Paris Agreement in 2015. That was actually a really hopeful moment for the world. First time the world comes together. It was an ambitious agreement. I was there. We're negotiating through the night, and we didn't know if we knew to get an agreement, but was it going to be ambitious? We did. But now we're in like the tough part. It's the implementation phase, and everyone has to be part of this, and that's why non-state actors are so critical. But getting it right is hard, and it's going to be messy. And we all need the input because you're going to have different vantage points on all of these issues, and I think that will create a richer discussion. It's all going to be transparent too, so that other folks will be able to see the submissions and take pieces of it or follow up, because I do think that is a really important piece, and it will be global. So I think one thing we should recognize, we're probably not particularly reflective of the world, but the world feels the impacts of all the decisions you guys make. So I think it is important that we also hear from the world, however that's constituted, including young people, like my kids, who are privileged, so also other young people who aren't, that are feeling the impacts, and then we all dig deep. There's the money. I'm told all the time, the money is there, 130 trillion. So let's get it moving. Let's get companies innovating, doing what they do best. Let's get this done.
Great. So lots of, well. So that's a big collective thank you to our three wonderful speakers. Now, you're going to hear a lot about transition plans, and not just net zero transition plans. And we didn't have any time really to talk about adaptation plans or nature recovery plans, but these are the next logical extension, I think, of this, and are going to be really important. And we only touched on some of the use cases. I mean, yes, there's a greenwashing use case, but there are other things too, including sustainability-linked instruments, how this can be useful for stewardship and engagement, amongst other things. It's a really important area, but one that is laced with risk, because I don't come away from these conversations feeling like we've completely addressed or will completely address the risks of this enabling further greenwashing. So we need to be very vigilant. We need to make sure that the TPT and other processes ensure that we have very credible transition plans. Okay, so this is actually the final plenary session today. I've double-checked the agenda. Apologies for the mistake before. So we're going to have a half-hour coffee break, tea break. The sessions will start 10 minutes later, so at 22. And as I said before, there'll be one plenary here, which I think is going to be on spatial finance. The one on international reporting is going to be in the East School, which is just through there. And the third and final one is downstairs, I think, in room 6. So please be prompt. And then after those finish, we're going to be reconvening at the Divinity School, which is a very short walk away. I imagine some Oxford people will lead the way, follow us, and there'll be a well-deserved drink for you there. So see you there at 6:30.
Ben, did anyone find the wild swimming spots? Kath McKenna at Twitter, just telling to
We've
say.
got a long list. Thank you.